Wyoming Territory, 1874. The wind carried dust and ruin through the town of Red Rock as the sun burned low behind the ridgeline. And Zinnia Ruthers stood on a wooden platform like an unwanted crate, being sold to a stranger to pay off her father's gambling debt. She did not cry. She had done her crying 4 nights ago when the sheriff came knocking, dragging her father out of their 2-room house for unpaid dues. The debt was large. The man who bought it, Mr. Kellen from the saloon, was larger. "She's 18, strong enough to help with cooking, can sew and read," barked the auctioneer. "Debt's 500. First bid." Zinnia clenched her hands behind her back. Her pale blue dress was clean but patched, and her boots were too big, her father's last gift. She kept her chin high, eyes locked on the horizon as if it could carry her away. 500, said a man in a suit, his face pockmarked, breath sour with liquor. Zinnia's stomach twisted. 550, came another voice, deeper, rasped by trailed dust and sun. She turned. The man was tall, sun-browned, with a wide-brimmed hat and a scar across his left cheek that only made his face more solid. His eyes, the color of storm-heavy clouds, were fixed on her like she was not a thing to be bought, but someone worth saving. "Name," the auctioneer called. "Jericho Lawson," the cowboy said. "I'll pay more," he stepped up onto the platform, "and keep her forever." The crowd murmured, some laughed, a few cursed. Zinnia froze. Mr. Kellen shoved his way forward, arms crossed, face red. "That girl's mine," Kellen growled. Deal was made. Jericho reached into his duster coat and pulled out a thick roll of banknotes. "I will pay double what you paid her father, in cash, here and now." "You think you can just buy her like a prize cow?" Kellen barked. "No," Jericho said, calm as still water. "I think I can stop her from being dragged into your saloon to work off a debt she never owed." The sheriff stepped forward, hands on his belt. "If Lawson's got the money and the girl agrees to it, I say the matter's settled." All eyes turned to Zinnia. Jericho turned, tipped his hat back just enough she could see his eyes fully. "You do not have to say yes," he said quietly, "but I will not let him take you." Zinnia stared at him, her heart a wild thing in her chest. She had no family left. Her mother died of fever when she was 10. Her father had been a broken man long before the debt. She had nothing and no one, except maybe now. "Someone, I agree," she said, her voice steady. Jericho paid the money directly into the sheriff's hand. Kellen cursed and stormed off. Jericho helped Zinnia down from the platform like she was made of something delicate. The crowd began to disperse, the sun dipping low. He led her to his horse, a black gelding with a white blaze. "We will ride for my ranch outside of town. You can stay in the main house." She blinked. "You live alone?" He hesitated. "Had a brother, lost him in the war, no family left, just me, the land, and the herd." Zinnia swung up behind him on the horse, her hands resting lightly on his coat. She did not know this man, but she had seen something in his eyes, grief and strength, and a promise she had not dared hope for. They rode in silence for a while, the prairie stretching out wide and golden. "You meant what you said?" she asked at last. "That you would keep me forever," Jericho glanced over his shoulder. "I do not say things I do not mean." They reached the ranch house after dusk. It was modest but sturdy, pine logs and stone chimney, a porch with a rocking chair. He helped her down and opened the door, rooms upstairs. "You can take the bed, I have a cot." She looked around, the warmth of the hearth reaching her fingers. "You do not have to sleep on a cot in your own house." He shrugged. "You are not here to be owned, you are safe now. Until you decide what you want from your life." Zinnia turned to him, her throat tight. "I want to feel like I belong somewhere." Jericho's eyes softened. "Then we will start there." The next day, Zinnia helped cook breakfast. Jericho was quiet but not distant. He showed her the barn, the horses, the garden she could tend. He did not touch her, not even when she brushed against him by the stove, but his gaze lingered, and hers did too. That night she stood on the porch in her nightdress, watching the moon rise. Jericho came out beside her, arms crossed. "You do not talk much," she said. He looked down at her. "Words are easy, actions matter more," she nodded. "I believe that." He hesitated. "You do not have to stay. I would not blame you if you wanted to leave, make your own way." "I do not want to leave," she said simply. "Not yet." His jaw tightened like he was holding something back. "Then stay as long as you like. 3 weeks passed. Zinnia worked beside him, learned to ride, laughed for the first time in months. Jericho kept his distance, but he always noticed when she was tired, always brought her tea when her hands were cold, always made her feel seen. One evening, she found him in the barn, brushing down the gelding. She stepped in, heart pounding. "I know you said I could decide what I want," she said. Jericho looked up, his hand stilling on the horse's flank. "I want to stay," she said. "Not just for now, I want to plant roots. With you." He stepped closer, eyes searching hers. "I do not just want safety," she said. "I want love. And I think I am falling in love with you." Jericho reached out, took her hand. "You are not the only one," she smiled, tears in her eyes. "Then say it." "I love you," he said, voice steady, sure. "I meant it the moment I saw you on that platform. I just did not know if I deserved you." She stepped into his arms. "You saved me. That is all I need to know." He kissed her, slow and careful, like he had waited his whole life for her, and maybe he had. The morning after the kiss, the wind came in colder. A rim of frost clung to the fence boards, and the horses blew steam into the dawn. Zinnia stood by the stove, sleeves rolled to her elbows, working cornmeal into a hot skillet. Jericho entered without sound, boots leaving faint tracks across the worn floorboards. He didn't speak right away, just watched her, his coat still dusted with the outside chill. "You always rise before the sun?" she asked without turning. "Sometimes I don't sleep at all," he said. "Old habit, from the trail." She set a plate on the table beside his chair. "Then you'll need this more than I do." He sat, nodding his thanks, but his eyes stayed on her longer than they needed to. She felt it and let the silence hold. After breakfast, Jericho hitched the wagon and loaded it with empty sacks. "I need to ride into town. Mill's expecting me before noon." Zinnia reached for her shawl. "Then I'll come with you." He paused, reins in hand. "It's a long ride, cold too." "I've ridden colder," she said, stepping up into the wagon beside him. "And I've got business at the mercantile." He didn't ask what kind. He only gave her a quiet nod and flicked the reins. The gelding pulled them forward, wheels crunching over frozen earth. They didn't speak much on the road. The rhythm of hooves and the creak of the wagon filled the space between them. She watched the land stretch wide ahead, dry grass silvered by frost, sky pale and cloudless. At the edge of town, a boy sprinted past the wagon, calling out to a man stacking crates. Jericho glanced toward the livery, then gestured toward the mercantile. "I'll be at the mill." "You need anything, tell Mrs. Dobbs," Zinnia nodded. "I won't be long." Inside the shop, she moved with purpose. Needles, thread, 2 yards of muslin, 1 of wool. Mrs. Dobbs raised a brow but didn't ask questions. Zinnia paid in coin, tucked the change in her pocket, and stepped back into the street. She didn't head straight for the wagon. Instead, she crossed to the other side where a narrow storefront bore a faded sign, "Hart, Tailoring and Repair." The bell over the door rang low as she entered. A woman behind the counter looked up from a bolt of tan linen. "Can I help you?" "I need work," Zinnia said. "Sewing, mending, I'll bring my own materials." The woman studied her, eyes narrowing. "You're Lawson's girl," Zinnia straightened. "I belong to no one." The woman gave a slow nod, then gestured to a basket of torn shirts by the wall. "You mend those, 5 cents apiece. Bring 'em back next week." Zinnia thanked her, gathered the basket, and returned to the wagon just as Jericho came striding up from the mill, sleeves rolled, sawdust clinging to his trousers. "What's that?" he asked, helping her hoist the basket into the back. "Work," she said. "I won't live here without pulling my weight." "You already do," he said, voice quiet. She climbed up beside him. "Then let me do more." The ride home was warmer, the sun higher. Zinnia rested her hand on the edge of the wagon, letting the wind slip between her fingers. Jericho didn't speak until they turned off the main road. "You don't need to prove anything to me," he said. "I'm not," she answered. "I'm doing it for myself." That night she stitched by lantern light, thimble flashing, thread tight between her fingers. Jericho sat nearby, sharpening a blade, his movements slow, deliberate. Neither of them spoke, but the space between them felt full, not empty. Later, he stood and crossed to the door. "I'll check the fence before bed." She looked up. "Will you be long?" His hand paused on the latch. "Not if there's nothing broken." When he returned, she'd set the needlework aside and was sweeping the last of the hearth ash into the pan. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with care. "I saw a fox near the chicken run," he said. "Didn't look hungry." "Just passing through." She leaned the broom against the wall. "Some things just come close to see what's here." He looked at her then, longer than he had all day. "And some things stay." Zinnia crossed to him, the distance between them shrinking like dusk before a lantern. "If they're welcome." He took her hand, calloused palm warm against hers. "You are." She rose onto her toes. "Then let me stay, not just under your roof, but with you." He kissed her again, this time with nothing held back. Later, as they lay together with the fire low and the frost returning outside, she traced the edge of the scar on his cheek. "What gave you that?" she whispered. "Mississippi," he said. "A boy no older than I was." "Neither of us wanted to be there." She pressed her lips to the place where bone met memory. "You came out the other side." "Not all of me," he said. She curled against him, her breath even. "Enough." They didn't speak again that night. The warmth of the room, the steady rhythm of each other's breathing, said more than words ever could. And somewhere out beyond the window, the fox moved on under a sky full of stars. By early December, the wind had turned sharp enough to cut through wool, and the first snow came down in a hush, blanketing the valley like a breath held too long. Zinnia stood at the window beside the hearth, her fingers wrapped around a mug of steeped pine and mint. Outside, Jericho was oiling the hinges of the barn door, his shoulders hunched against the cold. She watched the way he moved, slow, sure, deliberate. There was no waste in his effort, no hesitation. He carried the quiet of someone who had lived long with solitude and had made peace with it. But lately, he lingered longer at the table after supper. His fingers brushed hers more often when they passed tools or plates, and sometimes she caught him looking at her like he was still surprised she hadn't vanished. When he came inside, snow dusted his collar. He unwrapped his scarf and set his gloves down on the bench near the stove. "It's coming harder," he said, nodding toward the window. "Might trap us in till Sunday." Zinnia poured the last of the brew into a tin cup and handed it to him. "Then I'll start on the biscuits early. If we're stuck, we may as well eat warm." He took the cup, his fingers brushing hers. "You always find something to do with stillness." "I never knew stillness before," she said. "Not like this." He leaned against the wall, sipping slow. "You miss anything from town?" "Only the tailor's basket," she said. "But I've enough shirts to mend for 3 days at least." Jericho set his cup down. "There's a room off the west side of the house. Used to be my brother's. I've kept it closed." She turned toward him, her hands still wrapped in her apron. "You thinking of opening it? I figure. If you're staying, you ought to have space of your own, for sewing, for whatever you want that's yours." Zinnia stepped closer, her voice soft. "I don't need walls to feel something is mine." He didn't reach for her, but he didn't move away either. Even still. They opened the room together that afternoon. The hinges stuck, but Jericho worked them loose with a pocket tool and grit. Inside, the air was stale, but the light that came through the single window fell clean across a narrow bed, an empty bookshelf, and a small writing desk with one drawer. Zinnia ran her hand over the desk's surface. "He was older, 2 years, Jericho said. Name was Caleb. We rode west together after the war, thought we'd start fresh. He built this desk with his own hands." She didn't ask how he died. She didn't need to. "I'll keep the bed made," she said, "but I'll use the desk if that's all right." "That's why I showed you," he said. "So you could." That night, the snow fell thicker. Zinnia sat at the desk with a candle burning low and began stitching a length of muslin into a lined curtain. Jericho brought in fresh wood and paused near the doorway, watching her needle rise and fall through the fabric. "You always work by candlelight?" he asked. "Only when I want the quiet," she said. He nodded, then crossed to her and set a folded bundle on the desk. "Found this in a trunk out in the barn, thought it might suit you." She unfolded it, wool, dark green with a faded edge, but clean and well kept. It was a riding cloak, clearly made for a man but small in the shoulders. "This was his," she said. "It was," Jericho said, "but it isn't anymore." Zinnia stood, holding the cloak against her chest. "You're not afraid of letting go?" His voice was low. "I was. For a long time." She stepped toward him, the candlelight catching in her eyes. And now, I'm more afraid of holding on to the wrong things, he said. She reached up, her hand resting on his chest. And what am I? Jericho's hand came to rest over hers. You're the one thing I didn't expect, something I want to keep, not out of grief, but because you make this place feel alive. She leaned into him without hesitation this time. Their kiss broke with shared breath, not uncertainty. Afterward, Zinnia slept with her head on his chest, his arm curled around her middle, and the snow outside deepened into silence. There were no more words needed that night. Not when hearts had already said what mouths could not. In the morning, the world outside was white and hushed. Zinnia stood in the kitchen doorway, wrapped in the green cloak, watching the wind carry thin flurries across the yard. Jericho came up behind her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. You planning to go somewhere? He asked. I was thinking about walking to the edge of the property, she said. I want to see how far the fence runs. He reached for his coat. Then I'll come with you. Some things are better seen side by side. They walked out into the cold together, not speaking, their steps leaving a single trail behind them in the snow. The fence line ended at a dry creek bed, half filled with snow, with a cottonwood tree leaning toward the sky like it had grown tired of standing straight. Zinnia crouched near the base, brushing away frost from a bundle of broken wire, her breath rising in small clouds. Jericho stood a few paces off, hands on his hips, watching the horizon where the land lifted into low hills. We'll need to run new posts in spring. That corner won't hold cattle come thaw. Zinnia straightened, her cheeks flushed from cold. Then we'd better start cutting pine before the snow gets too deep. I've seen what happens when you wait too long. You've run fence before? His brow lifted, not doubting, just curious, not the hammering, but I've helped strip bark and carry rails. Folks back home wintered rough if fence wasn't mended early. Jericho nodded, thoughtful. We'll take the sled into the North Grove tomorrow. Pull what's usable before the ice sets in. As they turned back toward the house, wind shifted the tree limbs above, scattering flakes down over their shoulders. Zinnia reached up and caught one on the back of her glove, watching it melt. Do you ever miss riding? She asked. Jericho glanced at her. You mean drifting? No, just long rides, farther than town or timber, days where the only thing you hear is your horse breathing. He was quiet for a few steps. Sometimes, but I've had enough of running from things. She didn't answer. Her hand brushed his as they walked, and though neither of them said anything, he didn't pull away. That evening, after the wood was brought in and the animals fed, Zinnia stood at the washbasin, sleeves damp, shoulders tired. Jericho entered carrying a rough, wrapped parcel of thick paper under one arm. I found something, he said, setting it on the table. Was clearing the loft in the barn earlier. She dried her hands and opened it. Inside was a worn leather-bound book, the edges curled, a pencil tucked into the spine. It's a ledger, she said, flipping through the yellowed pages. From before me, he pointed toward the back. Last few pages are blank, thought you might use it. You've been writing some in the evenings. She touched the cover, tracing the initials burned into the corner. You knew I was keeping notes. I notice things, he said. You write careful, like you're trying to remember something before it disappears. Zinnia looked up. That's what my mother always said. If you don't write it down, it fades. Jericho nodded once, then turned toward the stove. Thought maybe you'd want to write what comes next. Not just what came before. Later, after darkness settled and the fire burned low, she sat at the table with the ledger open before her. Jericho was nearby, cleaning his rifle by lamplight. She glanced over. Did you always mean to stay in Wyoming? She asked. Or did you just stop here and never leave? He tightened the screws on the rifle's stock before answering. I planned to keep going. North maybe, toward Montana, but then Caleb got sick. He died here. I didn't see much point in moving after that. Zinnia closed the ledger. You never talk about him unless I ask. Jericho kept his eyes on the rifle. Talking doesn't change what happened. No, she said, standing, but it tells me who you are. He looked up then, really looked. You still want to know, she stepped closer. I wouldn't have asked if I didn't. His voice was quiet. He was better than me, quicker to laugh, quicker to forgive. When I came back from the war, I was half a man. Caleb didn't care. He took me in like I hadn't changed, but I had. Zinnia sat down across from him. You came home. That matters more than what you brought with you. I brought more than I should have, he said. She reached for his hand, the weight of it solid in hers. And now you're here with me. That matters too. Jericho looked down at their joined hands. You make this place feel like it could be something again. The fire crackled, quiet and steady. Outside, snow kept falling, soft against the roof. Inside, neither of them moved to break the moment. Zinnia whispered, I don't want to wonder anymore about where I stand. About what I am to you. Jericho's hand tightened around hers. You're not a debt, you're not a guest, you're what I wake to, what I look for. She leaned forward, her voice steady. Then let me stay as your wife. His breath caught just once, then he nodded. Not tomorrow, not next spring, now. Tonight if you'll have it. Zinnia smiled, her eyes wet but unafraid. I will. He rose and crossed to the trunk near the hearth, pulling out a folded bundle. Inside was a simple band of silver, dull with age but unbent. It was my mother's, he said. I kept it all this time. He placed it in her palm. They married before the fire, hands clasped, vows spoken quiet and sure. No preacher, no witness but the snow and the flame, but it was enough. When they lay down that night, it was not as strangers made familiar by time, but as two people who had chosen one another fully. And when morning came, it found them side by side, the warmth between them stronger than the cold outside. The snow had settled heavy across the valley by mid-January, deep enough that the wagon wheels stayed stabled and only the sleds were used beyond the yard. The sky hung low most days, a dull pewter that made the world feel closer, quieter. Zinnia had taken to rising before the first light, not out of habit, but because she liked the hush, the way her breath fogged the kitchen window as she kneaded bread, how the stove crackled as it came back to life. Jericho's boots came down the stairs just as she was setting the tin of biscuits by the hearth to rise. His hair was damp from washing, his shirt still unbuttoned at the collar. He leaned against the doorframe and watched her for a moment before speaking. I've been thinking about expanding the west field. There's enough runoff in spring to manage barley if I dig a proper channel. She wiped flour from her thumbs and turned to face him. You want to plant grain, not for selling, just for us, feed for the horses. Maybe flour if the mill opens to trade again. He paused. I don't like relying on town more than I have to, she nodded slowly. Then we'll need seed and I'll need to learn to thresh proper. I can teach you. Her eyes met his. You already have. He stepped forward and touched her cheek with the back of his hand, rough fingers careful as always. You're not just part of this place now, Zinnia. You're part of what it's becoming. That afternoon, they hitched the sled and rode out past the cottonwood, following the frozen creek bed toward the ridge. Jericho carried a spade across his lap. Zinnia held a rolled canvas of survey lines they'd sketched together the night before. The wind tugged at her bonnet, but she kept her chin up, eyes on the sweep of land ahead. At the ridge, Jericho dismounted and drove the spade into the crusted ground, testing where the frost ended. Zinnia crouched beside him, fingers tracing a patch of soil he'd exposed. This ground's darker than I expected, she said, rich with old roots. Caleb always said the best soil is where nothing's grown for a while. Jericho stood and looked out toward the snow-covered field. I think he'd have liked you. She rose, brushing her gloves clean. Then I'd have liked him too. They worked until the sun started to drop, marking the edges with pine stakes. Zinnia tied a length of red yarn to each one, watching them flutter in the wind like small flags. Before mounting the sled again, she looked back at the field in waiting. You think by summer it'll look like something? Jericho took her hand. By summer, this whole place will be different. The weeks passed with the steady rhythm only winter can bring. Zinnia divided her time between the sewing room and the garden beds she'd begun planning, even if they were still buried in snow. She read through Jericho's old almanacs by lantern light and drafted planting rows in pencil on torn ledger pages. Jericho spent his hours mending harnesses, carving fence pegs, and checking the barns after every storm. One evening, As they sat by the fire, Jericho oiling his boots, Zinnia darning the toe of her left stocking, he cleared his throat and said, "I wired the circuit judge. Asked him to come out in spring." She looked up. "Why? Wanted it legal," he said. "Proper." She folded the stocking in her lap. "You don't think we are?" "I do." He set the boot down and leaned forward. "But I want it in writing. I want your name to be mine, so no one can ever call you anything else." She reached for his hand. "Then I'll sign it in ink, and I'll wear the name like I was born with it." By late March, the snow had begun to run off the higher hills, and the west field thawed in patches. They spent their days clearing stone, hauling brush, and turning what soil they could. Jericho built her a bench at the edge of the field, smooth cedar sanded by hand, where she could rest and watch the wind move the grasses. The judge arrived mid-April, a square-jawed man who rode in with a black coat and a satchel of papers. They married again beneath the cottonwood, this time with signatures, ink, and a ribbon in Zinnia's hair. When Jericho kissed her after the vows, the judge tipped his hat and said, "Well, I've seen worse beginnings." That night they sat by the fire, not speaking, their chairs drawn close. Zinnia rested her head on Jericho's shoulder, and he laid his hand over hers, their rings glinting in the lamplight. By June, the field was green. The barley pushed up in straight rows, and the garden bloomed with squash, beans, and white daisies Zinnia had planted without telling him. She spent mornings barefoot in the dirt, sun on her shoulders, and evenings with her head on Jericho's chest as he read aloud from their one novel, pages soft from use. In the autumn, they harvested together. Jericho built a small millstone press on the edge of the barn, and Zinnia ground the kernels herself, flour dust clinging to her cheeks. She baked the first loaf in early October, and they ate it with salt and apple butter on the porch, wrapped in shawls, watching the aspens turn gold down the creek. As the first frost came again, Jericho carved her a wooden box for her sewing threads, each spool nestled in its own groove. He gave it to her one morning without preamble, setting it beside her plate as she stirred her tea. "It's maple," he said. "Same wood as the desk." She opened the lid slowly, fingers tracing each groove. "You remembered every color." "I remember everything about you." She rose and kissed him, long and without rush. They spent that winter the way they had the last, but warmer, fuller. The field lay resting beneath its snow, but the house was alive with the scent of dried herbs, the sound of laughter, the quiet surety of two people who had chosen, again and again, to stay. Years later, when neighbors came to ask advice on planting or fencing or marriage, they'd find Jericho in the field and Zinnia in the garden, her hands still strong, her eyes still watchful. And when they sat together beneath the cottonwood, older now, with lines around their eyes and silver in their hair, they did not speak of what they had lost. They spoke of what they had built together. Always.